Title of my dissertation, Forgiveness in an Age of Terror. Now, my interest in this actually started about, I want to say a decade ago, 11 years ago, for this reason. Hold on one sec.
You might have to copy and paste it.
I may have to copy and paste it, yes.
I love how at a critical moment the computer says, an unexpected error. Thank you, PCs.
Yes. I apologize in advance if this is disturbing. That, for me, was the prompt in terms of what I do now. I got interested approximately in 2008, taking a class on just war theory with Dr. Brunstetter here in the Political Science Department. Now, one of the things that came out of our readings was a discussion of terrorism and responses to terrorism, especially the idea that in many cases the justification for things like terrorism or freedom fighting, as it's sometimes called, whatever has been done to us is so offensive, so terrible, that almost anything could be justified in response. Which basically struck me at the time. The phrase that I came up with, or that was reverberating in my mind, was revenge without limits. The fruit of which you just saw. So I wondered, from a normative ethical point of view, are there any limits on revenge? Are there any proper ones? Are there any ethical ones? And there were a variety of responses to that question, specifically to the events of 9/11. Two excerpted here. This was from the actor Ron Silver, who has since passed away from cancer, but he delivered an address to the Republican National Convention in 2004, actually not that far away from Ground Zero, Madison Square Garden. 2,605 of my neighbors were murdered at the World Trade Center, men, women, and children, as they began their day on a brilliantly clear New York autumn morning, less than 4 miles from where I now stand. We will never forgive, never forget, and never excuse. Now, given the setting, he was very widely agreed with at the time. A slightly different one, although this was not nearly as large an event or as popular of one. This was actually a speech given at a seminar in St. Mary's College in California, approximately 2 months after 9/11. The title of the talk by one of the academics there was Osama bin Laden and the Duty to Forgive. The act of forgiveness sets aside the harm done us. It is willing to start anew. It refuses to let that past determine the future of the relation, at least insofar as it depends on us. It refuses to dwell on the harm done and to turn it over and over in the mind and fantasize about getting even. So these were just two of a wide variety of ways people responded to the events of September 11, 2001 in this country. So as I say, the ethical question I was wrestling with, are there appropriate limits or constraints on the acts of retaliation and revenge? For a variety of reasons, that that's not quite a scientific question that you can answer for a dissertation. So it led to a bit of an empirical puzzle nonetheless. What actually motivates individuals who have suffered through political acts and terrorism to forgive those acts? First of all, can they? Second of all, if they can, why? Now, why should political science care about this? This is usually something that gets relegated to the realm of moral and ethical theory, or even religion, as I'll discuss in a minute. But what we have found is that actually it's very salient for a variety of different studies and a variety of different settings, both in the social psychology literature and in the political science literature. There was a team of social psychologists who found that moral identity, the way to which you internalize and the salience triggered of your sense of moral identity, is something that enables you to forgive the 9/11 attackers greater. And if we are expending resources to go after, say, Al-Qaeda or Taliban in the field, we use missiles, we have collateral damage and civilians are killed because of those missiles. People in these experiments say they're less willing to have that happen. So that's actually an attitude that is directly relevant to what we're doing now in light of drone attacks and how they've been stepped up regarding not only who might get killed in that process, but also in terms of who they're used against. From a forgiveness standpoint, actually, it can be directed inward as well, specifically about what we as Americans, or rather our troops and foreign operatives worldwide, some psychological factors when we have greater identification under threat with our country, with our military, we become more willing to forgive any actions of our troops which might go outside the realm of the ethical overseas. And actually that's just kind of another study confirming that, in this case, the specific Iraqi case. Not that necessarily that means specific forgiveness of Abu Ghraib. That's just kind of an illustration of, well, okay, some of the actions that are taken. Now, what do I mean by forgiveness? This is actually not that easy a question to answer. Once you start getting into the realm of political psychology or social psychology in general, it becomes rather hard to operationalize that and hard to measure. Specifically in this case, a lot of the tools that are used to measure forgiveness and also to conceptualize how people react to this in the psychology literature are interpersonal. They come from me and my spouse. They come from me and a neighbor, me and a friend at school. And so the way forgiveness has often been studied so far has been in that setting. The ways we measure forgiveness so far have been in that setting. Is that appropriate for a setting like this? Not necessarily. The definition I'm using here is to talk about what we might call non-interpersonal forgiveness. Sometimes called forgiveness at a distance, sometimes called third-party forgiveness. I specifically drew on this from a team of research psychologists back east, specifically Daniel McIntosh and his associates back in 2004. In this case, I modified some of what they've said. Inter-individual pro-social change towards a perceived transgressor, where no direct relationship with the transgressor is or really present. The reason I say this, the odds of us sitting across from Osama bin Laden or any Ayman al-Zawahiri or any of the associated terrorists, A, is not very possible, nor is it very likely something you would want to happen for safety's sake. So the odds of this being a dyad of forgiveness are very unlikely, and so any transformation that takes place will be within one person. I say non-interpersonal for another reason. Namely, that most Americans are familiar with this and would forgive or not forgive this because we weren't there. Most Americans did not directly experience the events of 9/11, except those who lived in New York City, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. We saw it on the internet, we saw it on TV, so we're at some remove. It's a little more abstract than the kind of relationships forgiveness usually is studied under. Another question of how to measure it. These often come in the form of surveys. Typically self-administered, we ask someone, how much have you forgiven a person? These are two of the big ones, and I mention them because they were some of the first. The Enright Forgiveness Inventory comes out of the University of Wisconsin. Robert Enright and his colleagues, they were one of the first people to talk about forgiveness as a measurable process, but just that as a process, not a discrete decision. There is some kind of growth that takes place. The second one comes from Michael McCulloch, University of Florida, in terms of transgression-related interpersonal motivation, in terms of avoidance and approachability, so motivational sides of this. There is a specific kind of metric that gets used in the study I'm going to use, which has something in common with both of these, but it structures it according to a degree of forgiveness that has some unique features, which I'll show in a second. Now, in terms of the broader psychology of forgiveness, there actually, in the last 20 years, has been a pretty big explosion of research on this. We know more than ever before about psychologically what's associated with forgiveness, what predicts it very unlikely that people would forgive. So just kind of a summary thereof. The first two are somewhat intertwined. Perspective taking, in other words, being able to internalize and take one's perspective, theory of mind. This is basically putting yourself in another person's shoes. That's very highly correlated. Empathy, this one has a little more of an affective dimension, feeling compassion for, feeling affiliation with, is another big factor as well. Both of these sometimes interact with other causes or correlates as well. Guilt, interestingly enough, actually also is associated with forgiveness, or at the very least seeking forgiveness. If it's guilt, you're feeling guilty for a particular action. If it's shame, you're feeling universally judged. And so you feel devalued by someone, and you're less likely to enter into a forgiveness, reconciliation relationship. Gratitude, an attitude of thankfulness for life, counting your blessings, sort of focusing on what's most important in life. This seems to be something that goes hand in hand with forgiveness. Religiosity, this is probably the most controversial one for a couple reasons. Number one, some people then think that makes it great for being more religious. It doesn't. Secondly, it depends on how you measure religion. So for example, fairly robustly we can tell that more religious people will say that they are more willing to help those charitably, they're more willing to forgive their enemies. However, when we actually ask them to forgive specific offenses, they don't fare any better than anybody else. So a variation on the old adage that I love so much. I love humanity, however, it is people I cannot stand. But what we see here is that it interacts nonetheless in some very interesting ways. It doesn't encourage it. These are probably the usual suspects. Anger, predictably enough. Paranoia. Narcissism. This is actually probably the most predictable, but yes, probably most notable, in that you are easily offended, easily want to take revenge, easily feel insulted by someone or something, a general sense of entitlement. So you're not likely to forgive when you always think that you're being victimized. Rumination, this is another important one, especially when we're talking about something that takes place over time. And a lot of the forgiveness literature has become increasingly sensitive to the longitudinal factor. People holding on to grudges over time. People constantly keeping in mind the original offense over time. Now, what does any of this have to do with politics, which political science is kind of my field? Well, actually a fair bit. Most of what we know about forgiveness in politics comes from situations of civil war, the end of some kind of authoritarian regime where you have a lot of violence, cases of genocide, cases of civil war, and these have been studied in a variety of contexts. Some of the most important have actually been in the context of Northern Ireland. A team led by Ed Cairns and his associates up there have actually looked at a number of situations of the contact hypotheses, greater interaction and empathy between Protestants and Catholics, leading to greater forgiveness of each side's offenses. We also see it a lot in South Africa, especially in the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was started by, among other people, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, as well as one of the researchers whose work I drew on a lot. Her name is Pumla Gobodo Madikizela, and please do not ask me to say that 3 times fast, who is actually a psychotherapist who did some of the first interviews with Eugene de Kock, one of the most notorious officers of the South African secret police, and reaching an accord and empathy with him and trying to get a sense of how he could be forgiven. However, it's got some potential issues. First of all, a lot of these take place in public truth-telling situations, one of which, the conditions, for example, in TRC, people are not going to get prosecuted if they come forward and tell their story. So a lot of people are going, well, then where's the accountability? Second, how many people who actually come before that, tell their story of being a victimizer, are actually going to be contrite? Much fewer. Number 3, how many people who come before this are actually the high-level decision makers who learn some of these things? Even fewer. Finally, most disturbingly in some cases, for example in South Africa, what do you think the proportion of black to white people who came forward, gave their accounts, and in some cases asked for forgiveness actually were? It's about 4 to 1 in the favor of blacks. Why? Well, you did have black militants in the MK wing of the African National Congress, but in almost all cases, you still have an unrepentant white majority. This is not unique to cases like South Africa. Very often, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, even though they are face-to-face, and in some cases have facilitated forgiveness and reconciliation, nonetheless, a lot of people are feeling they've left much to be desired. Now, we know most of these take place in a context where war or conflict has already ceased, and we're peeking at the pieces and settling those scores. When a conflict's still ongoing, however, we don't know quite as much. We also don't always know quite as much when we're talking about a situation where the people involved cannot actually meet, nor are they likely to. In order to get a sense of that, we have to kind of understand what those of 9/11 on the ground, both nationally and proximally to ground zero places in New York and Washington, actually went through. Well, we did see a marked rise in panic attacks, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, related emotional issues, in some cases dissociative ones. Although I should qualify this, and I'm drawing here on the findings of Dr. Silver and her colleagues over at Psychosocial Behavior, most Americans, and actually a majority of New Yorkers and Washingtonians, did not have this problem. Or to the degree that they did, the symptoms were actually a lot less of a shorter duration than is sometimes supposed. So people are actually fairly resilient. The question is, what makes them resilient? Among the things that appear to, that they found in studies, both using the data that I am using and also others, different kinds of psychological factors, including a search for personal meaning or making sense of the events, putting it into some kind of perspective, positive affect of whatever kind, And this one is actually from a positive psychology team of researchers. Gratitude, hope, kindness, leadership, love, spirituality, and teamwork are among the traits that they looked at. So we have some good news in terms of how people handled it, and we have some idea of the strategies they used. The question then becomes, how might any of this be related to forgiveness of the attackers? We know that at least some did, some rather publicly. Just to interrupt here, let me give you a different, hopefully less disturbing video.
Lyndon Harris, an Episcopal priest, was serving at historic St. Paul's Chapel nearby the Twin Towers when the attacks came. In the days after 9/11, St. Paul's became a support center for the rescue workers and the families of victims. Now, several years later, the initial anger Harris felt has given way to a different and what some would say controversial response. Harris is trying to gain support for the creation of a garden of forgiveness at or around the Ground Zero site.
What we hope to do is to present a meditation garden where people can come and at least reflect on the possibility of forgiveness. And by that, we don't mean that we in any way excuse horrific acts by evil people. We don't in any way condone acts of violence or terrorism. What we want to do is we want to invite people to decide intentionally to opt out of that cycle of violence and revenge.
Harris has been helping to launch gardens of forgiveness in other cities, but doing so around Ground Zero, where most of the space is spoken for and feelings remain so raw, may be a near impossible challenge.
I think it's absurd. I don't think we should forgive the people who did this to us.
I was very delighted when I was told that's what you guys were doing. I think it's overdue. Forgiveness is what we're supposed to do.
I think if we don't show a little forgiveness, then we're no better than the terrorists that acted upon it in the first place.
For some people that would work, but other people, they have so much anger inside of them that they're never going to be able to forgive the people who did this to them, especially people who lost close loved ones.
I think that these families need some closure, and the only way they're going to get closure is to see when justification is done on the man that put out the attack.
That's one of the major misconceptions about forgiveness. I can be hurt by you and decide that I have to make sure that you don't hurt me again. I can do it with hatred in my heart, or I can do it with some sense of compassion for my predicament, or I can do it with a sense of forgiving the human qualities that lead people to do harsh, violent acts. But I still want to make sure I'm safe. And what we're suggesting is through our garden is that you reflect on ways to keep yourself safe without having to be as hate-filled or as vengeance-minded as the people who did this to us.
But I would not say to any family, you must forgive, because that's an individual choice. And far be it from me, not having suffered the loss of a family member on 9/11, to tell anyone who did that they have to get on with their lives.
These signs are all over.
While the idea of a garden of forgiveness has met with resistance, it has support from a number of families who lost loved ones on 9/11, including Diane Horning, who lost her son Matthew, Rose Fody, who lost her son Robert, and Lynn McGuinn, who lost her husband Frank.
Are they enough of
Oh, there he is. Francis Noel McQueen.
Did he pronounce it Noel or Noel?
Noel.
Oh, is that Noel because of Christmas?
Yes.
I think America's ready for some sort of shake-up idea. It needs to change. The thought processes need to move from I've been wronged to I would like to embrace another idea instead of anger, instead of bitterness, instead of war, instead of hate, instead of bias or prejudice. These are not things we need to be teaching our children.
We need a garden of forgiveness. I don't know that we're ready for it.
I really don't know.
So, what you get a sense is that, at least for some people, this appears to be an option. The question is for how many, and the question has to do with, if so, what are the reasons? Now, in order to answer that question, at least in part, for my dissertation, I decided to look at some survey research that might shed some light on that question. Specifically, this comes from a multi-year study that was originally collected for clinical research purposes by a team of social psychologists and clinical psychologists based here at UCI, but also with some scholars throughout the nation. Roxy Silver and Dr. Allison Holman here at UCI, and a variety of different scholars, including Dr. Poulin, Michael Poulin, who is actually teaches in his own position now, but actually was a graduate student here working on this project when at the time it was first conducted. This was funded by the NSF actually, and it was conducted over the course of 3 years at about 6-7 points in time. So approximately between, in other words, just after the September 11th attacks to about the anniversary 3 years later in 2004, I used for my particular dissertation waves 2 and 6 out of this survey, which are respectively approximately 2 months and about 24 months after 9/11, so approximately 2 months and 2 years. The way they collected this was not exactly the typical thing you think of when you think of a survey. A lot of people, when they hear survey, think telephones. That's actually not how this works. There's a company called Knowledge Networks, which has a regular stable of research panel participants online. And they've instituted a number of controls, which are too numerous to list here and probably incomprehensible to most of you, including me, as to how they make sure that this is nationally representative, but suffice to say, in a variety of publications and a variety of studies, it has been shown to be. Each household they survey has internet access. If not, they are provided with one. I know sometimes there's questions of socioeconomic status and income that go into that. In this case, if people did not have one, they were provided with that access. The initial size, actually, for a national level survey was quite good, around 2,700 adults. That had some attrition over the next several years, but nonetheless, you're talking about about 4 digits size in terms of the end size. So we're still getting a very good, statistically reliable sample each time. Now, among those things that got assessed in the original survey were a variety of different things that were relevant from a clinical point of view and a psychological point of view. A number of demographics, including the standard ones about age, household income, race or ethnicity, and also a number of other psychological things that got collected, beliefs about the world, one of the things called the world assumption scale in terms of what you believe about the world, how hospitable a place is the world, how random and left up to chance are events, how much influence can you have over events, ability to find meaning in the events and how you make sense of those events, goals you may have for the future, how did you perceive or experience the events of 9/11, and this does not include the psychological component, but also literal things like how close were you? Did you lose someone? Did you know someone, say, on the planes? If you were in New York, how many blocks away were you? Did you have clinical symptoms that arose because of your proximity? Like I say, a lot of people because of PTS kind of symptoms. And so, for a variety of reasons, this has been used in a host of studies, both clinically and also broader findings within the academic peer-reviewed research in social psychology in general. But for me, one of the key questions in here was, which of the following statements best reflects your feelings regarding forgiveness of those responsible for the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Of those responses, and they framed this on a 1 to 5 scale, I don't think they should be forgiven. I do not intend to try. Even if they should be, I can't imagine doing so. I can't think of forgiveness now, maybe later. Although I can't say I've forgiven them, I'm trying, and I have forgiven. This was framed typically as what we call a Likert scale, for those of you who don't speak social sciences, which is basically 1 to 5, greatest, least kind of way of framing it. I'm sure there are more accessible ways to put that instead of Likert, but in any case, this is the kind of measure a lot of these questions on the survey took. So this was my dependent variable when I was looking at possible things that could influence forgiveness. Now, in terms of when you do studies like this, you want to try and see, well, how much can just be accounted for by basic demographics and other things that are typically used as controls. In my case, I looked at, in this case, age, gender, level of education, and household income. Now, if you're wondering why race and ethnicity is not up there, I actually tried it, and it did not terribly work very well. Why? Because it reduced the number of cases that I was dealing with to a level which reduced my sample size by about 1/3, which would not be terribly reliable for statistical reasons. So that one for the moment is left off. Trying to deal with race is one of the next things I'm going to try and do. Right at the moment, I'm going to go ahead and stick with these. So any one of these may have something to do, although theoretically there's only really justification for thinking gender might have something to do with it. I had specifically, from my point of view, cognitive features I was interested in. These had to do very much with how do you find meaning in the events? Have you actually found any? Finding unexpected positive consequences, which I refer to in my dissertation as benefit finding. Time orientation. This is actually something drawn from a couple of different sets of literature in terms of future or present orientation, centered in the present or looking towards the future, or stuck in the past. And also a religious orientation one, intrinsic, extrinsic, and extrinsic has a couple of different dimensions. A personal kind, which is narrowly instrumental for your own, used as a means to an end. Social in terms of you like hanging out with other people within the context of your religion. And intrinsic being your religion is interiorized to all parts of your life. You're doing it as an end in itself. So this will hopefully give, if I use this kind of typology, a little more sense of what we mean when we say religion could influence forgiveness. Lastly, there were a couple of worldview assumptions. These are collations from, I should say, a larger scale. These were statistically the ones that kind of got pulled into subscales that showed a high level of interior correlation themselves. Broadly speaking, one that referred to is the world of benevolent place. After the conclusion of the talk, I can show you the particular questions that went into these subscales if you like. One about how random a world do we live in? And finally, one, can people have some control over events in the world? Now, in terms of results, apologize the size of this. This, broadly speaking, this and the next chart following it are basically summaries of the different models I ran. Let me briefly explain for the uninitiated what I mean by the different terms here. The strategy I used is something called multinomial logistic regression. There are a couple of reasons why it's called that, and there are a couple of reasons why I use that. Broadly speaking, typically studies like this, when they use regression, means they just run the scale as a set of numbers, 1 to 5. And they do a regression of processing what those numbers mean and how much variation is explained in 1 to 5. Well, the problem that I thought was that not everybody is going to take the leap from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, in terms of not forgiving at all to maybe forgiving, completely forgiving the same way. So multinomial logistic regression means that I treated each of those as a separate answer with different odds. the odds of completely forgiving, for example, relevant to the odds of completely not forgiving. So when I stuck them all into the models, I did so in stages. This first one refers only to keeping the demographics, race, excuse me, not race, education, household income, also gender, and also,
H?
yes. I apologize, it's Friday afternoon, I've got a rented set of lips today. In any case, the second model incorporates the more psychological things I was interested in from the perspective of seeking meaning, finding meaning in the events, finding positive benefits in the events, and also 2 questions which tapped time orientation, specifically one with a negative past orientation, stuck in the past in a bad way, and a present-centered orientation. And I can also show you later, if you like, the questions that tap that. The third has to do, and this is only one that had these variables present for 2 months after 9/11, the religious orientation questions. And the last ones are the full model with, respectively, some of the worldview variables incorporated. 2 different ones in each case. In terms of one of the worldview ones had to do with, I think 2 months after 9/11 included benevolence of the world and one about chance. 24 months it was benevolence of the world and something more along the lines of world controllability. So what these numbers mean, all were significant, all my models were significant. The likelihood ratio and the p-values kind of indicate that. And I experienced an acceptable level of decline in terms of how many n, because one of the things, this is list-wise deletion, so it excludes anyone who didn't answer at least one of the questions. If you've got a large enough n size, which is to say number of people in the sample, and you lose only a small amount each time, that means your results are going to remain pretty reliable, which is what happened here. So these are significant. Then the question then becomes, by how much? How much do they actually explain? In each case, each of the steps, demographics, a question about the cognitive variables, the religious question, and then finally the worldview questions, added a degree of explanation each time. Now, okay, and this will be the last piece of statistic-ese I use. Thank you for putting up with me in that regard. The McFadden pseudo R-squared, usually an R-squared is read as how much of the variance in this do you see explained, percentage-wise. So typically, 13.08 would mean about 13.08% of it was explained by the model I used. Because I'm using kind of a multiple choice, like answer A versus answer E, answer B versus answer E, kind of odds, it's a little harder to generalize about what, in this case, it would mean. They call it pseudo R-squared because it's roughly the same. So what you can see is each one added something, although not terribly much. So we know that, at least in a partial sense, the things that I was hoping would predict forgiveness are predicting forgiveness, but not by terribly much. So that's an interesting thing that I'm going to have to take a look at in the future. Now, one of the things that I also did was to say, this used the 1 to 5 scale. This one, the results of which are not terribly different, converted that 1 to 5 scale into a 1 to 3 scale. The reason I did that is because the scale answer for forgiveness that I used only got used once before. So there are a number of different ways you could possibly use it. So these would be according to pro-forgiveness, not sure, and anti-forgiveness. But what we can see is that it doesn't really make too much of a difference. They're both looking at approximately the same thing. So what do I find based on that and based on the later parts of my dissertation I don't have time to review here? Gender does have a relationship. It's a significantly positive one insofar as women were more likely to forgive or had a greater relative rate versus not forgiving than men. There are a variety of reasons why that could be the case. That could be socialization, that could be something about psychology that's already innate to women. We don't know yet. That's something that has to be teased out. And it's not just that we don't know yet with my research, it's throughout the forgiveness research as well. Seeking meaning didn't really seem to do anything. Seeking meaning, just, you haven't resolved it yet, but that didn't seem to have much of a relationship at all. Finding meaning, having found meaning in the events of 9/11, did have a relationship with forgiveness. A greater association when you were more likely to find meaning in the events, you were more likely to have completely forgiven. Benefit finding, same story. Finding unexpected positive consequences in the events did have a significant relationship. A present-centered time orientation, specifically this was tapped by a question that says, I try to live one day at a time. That had a significant positive relationship in terms of being more likely that you would choose to forgive, which is completely not. A negative-centered past orientation, this was a little trickier in the sense of you're stuck in a past in a not good way. You're haunted by things in your past. You keep thinking about negative things that happened to you. Well, that only had a significant negative relationship with forgiveness about 24 months out, not just 2 months out. There are a variety of reasons why that might be. The simplest one being, well, 2 months out is still fresh in your mind. It doesn't feel like the past yet. Whereas 2 years down the line, you may have a level at which you're looking at the formation of memories about that event that happened in negative valence. Something would be explored further, and there are psychological theories and findings, including those of Barbara Fredrickson, in terms of peak and end value theory, in terms of how events are processed in a sequential fashion that would explain that. Religious orientation, this was the fun one. Intrinsic religious orientation did a lot of work in this. Matter of fact, it did as much explanation of why people would fully forgive as any of the cognitive ones did altogether. So it was pretty huge among the results that I had. Now, the extrinsic religious orientation, for a personal level, didn't really do much. Not very significant. The social one, and also there's an additional one that popped in called quest religious orientation, in that I think questions are more, in essence, part of my religious quest than answers. Those didn't really have, they were both significant, but only in the middle of the scale, as in I can't think about forgiveness now, maybe later. So it's not clear what relationship they had. That's something to be teased out further, I think. Worldviews. Benevolent World appeared in both waves, 2 months out and 2 years out, and it didn't really do anything. It didn't really explain one way or the other whether people forgave, people who found the world a friendly place, just there was no real overlap with forgiveness in any significant way. World controllability, a significant negative relationship. The more likely you think that human beings can have some control over the affairs in the world, the less likely you were to forgive. I did not expect this. Specifically, I thought that the more chaotic a place that you thought the world was, the more likely you would be not to forgive. But this could point out a possible limitation in the model I used. Specifically, I was working on forgiveness as a non-interpersonal process, where you're dealing with a very abstract thing. What this could point to is that actually people were dealing with this on a personal level, even if it's simulated. Which is to say, the more control people think they have over their actions, the more likely they are to judge and not forgive those who did this. That's not what I expected. That's something I want to explore further. Presence of chance and randomness. Interestingly enough, that did have a significant negative relationship. So maybe that's another wrinkle where people do not see these two as connected. That the events of the world are one thing, and we do have a sense that that has a negative impact. But you can still have negative feelings about the world being a predictable place and still insist that people have control over their own actions and their own destiny. So that's a possibility. I initially thought those were maybe part of the same thing, one or the other. They appear to be distinct. I think that's something I also want to explore further. Now, potential issues and unanswered questions about what I just found. First of all, measurement is an issue. This questionnaire, if I may, is a little vague. Namely, here, should be forgiven, forgive, forgive, forgive. The first two questions are about what you should do, or they use language like that. The last three are about what you've done, or what you might do. So are these really all on the same scale? Do they belong on the same scale? Maybe, maybe not. We need greater specificity in how that works. Second of all, I use something that's fairly esoteric. I've kind of given you sort of hopefully a brief, very simplified and crude view of what the multinomial logistic regression thing that I used was. But that's very hard to explain to people, and it's not necessarily easy to say, well, how much of this did I explain and how could I generalize from there? So these are very sensitive to the kind of measures and number crunching you want to do. Another question is explanatory power. Even though I cannot directly tie these to how much variance did I explain, even if we have a rough approximation, these numbers aren't terribly high. They do explain significance in forgiveness, but they don't really explain that much of it. So that is a question of maybe there's other variables that would contribute to that I haven't run here. I can think of a couple right off the bat. First of all, maybe this is a more personal process that involves emotion than I thought. I initially thought this is kind of going to be a cognitive abstract thing because you're dealing with people at a distance. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe people still take it personally. Another thing is, what I didn't include here, just because I didn't have time or space, is clinical history of who got kind of stricken with clinical problems in terms of PTS or depression or actual physical injury, things like that. Knowing that kind of case history could make a very big difference. Proximity to the events as well. Another question, and this is one that's directly related to political science, has to do with, okay, I have an idea, at least on some front, how people forgive. So I know what motivations they might have for doing something political about it. But how do we link this directly to, say, a choice in the ballot box, or a protest, or a visit to your congressperson saying, do not bomb X or Y country? We don't know that link yet. I've given a stepping stone as to how we might, but we don't know yet how to link this to that. We do have in later waves of this survey questions about the impending Iraq war that was about to start in 2003. So it's possible, but that's the research direction I want to take next. Ran out of time this time. The last one is something I thought about over the course of this that got pointed out to me by the third member of my committee, which is I'm assuming throughout all this that forgiveness is a good thing, clinically and politically. Well, politically, we can leave that aside for now, but clinically, there is a thrust throughout the forgiveness literature that I read, that I digested, and that I used, that holds a very strong finding about forgiveness and health, especially mental health. And that if you do not forgive, even something like this, you are not as healthy. Does anybody think there's an ethical problem with that? I think of a couple. The main one came to me when I was researching some stuff for revisions for this. Holocaust survivor named Jean Lamery, who's actually from Belgium. And he was involved in the resistance. He was captured, and the Nazis had a very interesting thing with him where they were in a back warehouse room. They hoisted him, they tied his hands behind him on handcuffs. Then they hoisted him by those with a chain, with a hook on the end, and hoisted him up there and held him there long enough until they dislocated both the shoulders. And they beat the crap out of him. And so he physically never fully recovered from that. And he, as an author, as a public speaker, was exposed to a number of calls to make up, to live and let live, to bury the past, to move on. And he always took this very personally because he did not feel mentally whole. Actually, he committed suicide in the late 1970s because he could no longer live with the kind of meaningless world he was encountering. But one of the things he said in an essay called At the Mind's Limits is, "It is my moral duty to remain mentally unhealthy, to see that justice is done. It is my duty to ruminate on these events and hold a grudge until justice is done. The duty I have, the responsibility, the moral responsibility I have, is not to let go of the past and move on, but to hold on to the past even when everybody else says that's pathological, in the name of justice that should be done." I did not have a good response to that. I don't have a good response to that, and I don't think this is a good response to that. Partially because it's an empirical thing, but I also think that I proceeded most of this dissertation not thinking that was the case. So from a normative point of view, I think some fundamental questions have to be answered about forgiveness research itself. Okay, this I think I've already covered to a degree. The one thing I do want to say before I end is a question about narrative. What I did here is survey research. We don't know, however, the longer story involved in what people might forgive, how they would tell that story of themselves, how they would highlight different things that contributed to that. We need to collect that info. There are ways of doing it. At least one attempt already has. One of the authors associated with gaining the info for this survey, a guy named Michael Poulin and his colleague Jonathan Adler, had a study that came out in 2009 called The Personal is Political, Narratives of 9/11. And there are open-ended questions about how people made sense of all this on that survey that they then took and ran a narrative analysis of. And I asked very nicely, with an assist from Dr. Silver, and Drs. Adler and Poulin gave me their data. So I may be able to do something with that in the near future. We'll see. But we need to know the stories. Narrative is everything here. Narrative ties all this ethical stuff into the one person who lives and moves through time. What I've done is just scratching the surface of what we can do, and admittedly only a partial answer at that. But hopefully we can tell a story about how forgiveness happens, whether it's a good idea or not, who forgives and why in subsequent research and subsequent generations. And that's my story. Thank you. Go ahead.
In your study, were you able to make a comparison between the events of Oklahoma bombing and the forgiveness of society in that attack as opposed to 9/11?
The short answer is no, partially because that would take 3 dissertations, but also because the data for that is a little more diffuse. A different research team conducted it, and we haven't seen it necessarily always explicitly used for the purposes of forgiveness. Dr. Holman and Dr. Silver, who I worked with to get this data and use their data, have also done similar studies after Oklahoma City. And actually, some of this national sample that they've used in different waves, I don't know if these two that I used oversampled to a degree in Oklahoma City and other places like Littleton, Colorado, that had also seen violent incidents like Columbine or the bombings in Oklahoma City, to see if, given how sensitive they were and how much they had seen symptoms of depression, PTS symptoms and things like that in a comparable stage, how much worse they would have fared after this. I think it's possible to get those data, but right now, the way it stands in this, it's sort of aggregated into the rest of the national level sample. It would take a few extra coding things from the survey data I have to kind of suss those out, disaggregate those, and see what they were like on their own. So the short answer is yes, I think data have been collected by that, but I would need to do a little bit of homework to see where they are and how to actually use them.
My second question is, did you make any correlations as far as fulfillment of, when fulfillment is reached about revenge, if people are able to begin to forgive once they feel, for instance, I don't know if there was any indication on the attacks on Iraq, and if people felt that it was justified, and therefore they felt fulfilled, and so justice was done. Go forward.
We do have questions about closure in the survey, but those are not specific to questions of revenge. The questions as to feeling that fulfillment in light of the Iraq War, what we have, at least in terms of the data I received, was about leading up to the Iraq War and conduct of it. The questions that appeared in the survey right then did not have a sense of, do you feel fulfilled now that we've taken this? So not directly. But I think, again, one of the things I hope to do is look at some of the Iraq War-related findings, because they occur in the same waves that forgiveness questions are asked. So I know the possibility of making that link is there, just haven't made it yet.
It will be interesting to see the correlation, how society viewed the attack on Iraq as opposed to what really happened on 9/11, which there were two separate things.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I mean, I'm reminded of an anecdote where one of the photos that was floating around in the media coverage of when we first went into Iraq, we did shock and awe. There was one fighter bomber who they were about to take off, but one of the munitions dangling from the side of their plane, under the ordnance cache, written on the munition was "Payback's a bitch, ain't it?" In other words, 9/11 related payback, Iraq. So we know that at least some ways people thought like that. I mean, that's an anecdotal way of putting it, but we know that at least public opinion data has suggested a significant portion of the population believed that there was a tie between the events of 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. That's fairly well established. The question then becomes, did that influence their wish to gain revenge on 9/11 via attacking Iraq? Or once that happened, did they feel closure? If there is survey data out there on that, either I don't know directly about it, or I would need to do some homework to find out what it is. So I think there is a relationship there, and I think the appropriate instruments definitely would probably show something in that regard. The question, would it show, and who would we need to ask? The ones that got asked there were public opinion surveys that were typically conducted by the news, not by clinical work such as this. Not that I think statistically it would matter, but I think it would take some doing to kind of sync up results like that to try to get a sense of what actually they were tapping. Because you would not get, I don't think, the same kind of attention to psychological details in a survey for the news as you would for a clinical survey.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So what does forgiveness, what does it mean?
Well, forgiveness, as I was looking at it, was an internal sense of turning hostile feelings towards an offender, someone who has injured you, someone who has victimized you, into positive feelings and motivations, which can be accompanied by actions, not to seek undue revenge or harm against them. In the case that I was looking at, and I think really crucial to that, is who. Forgiveness of a particular person, of a country, of a race, of terrorists you will never meet. That begins to alter what forgiveness looks like. I've offered one possible answer as to what it could. The way I've heard it put, intra-individual pro-social change towards a perceived aggressor and initiation of positive relationships with them.
But it doesn't say anything about the event that had happened. There's no judgment about that involved. It's just about interpersonal relations and feelings?
In part, there are differing opinions as to how much the actual event plays into that. It's judgments about the event that are typically brought into that, with reference to the specific person who caused it.
Because and also I'm wondering, secondly, I mean, I always thought that 9/11 was, I mean, when you see the imploded buildings, you know, clearly it was an inside job, which, you know, and Bush's brother was in charge of the security of the buildings, and so I always assumed that it had been done by certain politicians here in this country.
That's an interesting question in terms of who was ultimately responsible. I've heard and seen some of the studies that we talked about. For a variety of reasons, personally, I'm not entirely persuaded.
So I'm wondering if that matters, you know, with the
Well, it could, but I think from a forgiveness point of view, it wouldn't terribly matter, because you would still have someone responsible.
someone, right?
Someone. And you would still want to decide how to respond to them. And the motivation for that, I don't think would change. I mean, at least for my purposes, depending on if it was a supposedly inside job versus whether it was actually someone. So for my purposes, I don't think it would matter. For the purposes of actual political action, that's above my pay grade, you know, in terms of saying how that would turn out. But I think it's, in any case, you're looking at similar questions of psychological ways of processing through the event and those who committed the event that would need to be gone through. Now, a specific distinction that the literature makes is forgiveness is the act of accepting what happened, of resolving not to act towards them in a similar fashion. But it does not have to mean reconciliation. It does not have to mean initiating a formal relationship with them again. And especially not when, for example, some of the biggest criticisms of the forgiveness research came from assault and battery, criminology research on battered women. Forgiveness there of a woman, of her partner, not only kind of looks morally problematic, but even physically dangerous. You know, going back to a man kind of thing. So one of the things over the years that forgiveness literature has tried to do at varying levels of success in terms of who they've convinced is to say forgiveness and reconciliation in terms of reinitiating a relationship is not the same thing. You can harbor goodwill or no ill will towards someone, certainly, and not take undue reprisal against them. That is not the same thing as moving back in with them and, you know, everything's all hunky-dory again. So I don't think it's a stretch to say reconciliation with Osama bin Laden or any of those who follow him is an option. That is not an option. But I do think or at least on a, and this is just me talking from an ethical and political level on my own opinion, not from the point of view of my research, is that the difference it might make is in how Americans responded to such acts in the future. Do we endorse certain more aggressive kind of foreign policy against acts of terrorism as opposed to a more measured one? I think that's the difference that might be made, and that's the difference I want to see in the next part of the research I do to try and link this to the political phenomenon. My hunch is that when you see a more forgiving population, you see a population that is willing to be more proportionate and measured in its responses to terrorism. But that's a link I want to try and make in the future.
I have a comment, kind of a question, unless somebody else, I'm sorry.
No, you have about
Okay, really quick.
3 minutes for comments and questions.
Okay, I know. I'm just, you said you're really interested in the narrative about it, and I think your model shows a little bit of a narrative, and like between the waves, that your pseudo R-squared went down significantly.
It depends.
Well, I don't know if it's significant, but half your fourth model, it went
Well,
from like
okay.
0.13.
Maybe I should briefly explain why that was.
Oh, you know why that was?
Well,
Okay.
yes. The short answer is that wave 2,
I'm looking
2
at
months out.
4. I'm looking at.
No, I know,
model
I know.
4. Oh.
2 months has an additional set of variables, the religious ones, that were not present in wave 4.
No, I'm looking at model 4, the
I know,
difference
I know,
between
I know.
2 and 4 is 0.13 and then 0.06 for your pseudo R-squared.
No, I
So-
understand.
Oh, okay.
The-
Then I don't understand it.
Well, okay, at 2 months, what I just added was the worldview ones for this model. However, they also have the religious orientation ones. 24 months does not have the religious orientation ones. If they did, then it would be approximately the same.
Oh, okay,
No, sorry, I should have explained that.
okay.
No,
That
it's one of these
makes
things where you're limited by the data you have.
Yeah, no, that, I was thinking that people, they're either gonna forgive at 2 months or
Right.
that's it. And maybe that's part of the narrative. And then this person that you brought up, who has this moral view that you have to never, you know, forgive. It makes me think of the mantra of 9/11, to never forget. And you hear this anecdotally, forgive and forget. And so I'm just wondering maybe if that's all part of the narrative in the social.
Well, I think it has to be. I mean, anytime you talk about shared collective memories of the large political event, you are talking about different ways people understand that at the time and over time.
And then it'd be interesting to see descriptive statistics, like how many people answered number 5 or number 1.
Right.
as
Well,
far as
actually,
respondents.
briefly, I can tell you.
Sorry,
Over a majority, probably at least 50-odd%, said no under no circumstances.
we're number 1, number 1.
Right.
Oh, okay, interesting.
So the vast majority of
One
people.
is no certain.
Yeah, under no circumstances.
I would agree, that would be interesting just as a slide to
Yeah.
present,
Yeah.
because it says a lot about, like, that's really.
Yeah, that helps.
Sorry, I
Paint the
just
picture.
had one of these things where,
No, it's
okay,
okay.
these charts were confusing
No,
enough.
that was good. That was really good.
Okay, so anything else?
I typed the comments as I was making them, and I sent them to your email,
Okay.
so, and I'll add that, but
Got it. Well, thank you very much.
thank you.
Yeah, good job.
It's awesome.